My father was the youngest of 9 children. His oldest brother, Presley, was in several ways the humanizing, loving, generous patriarch of our family. He didn't have children of his own, which put him in that beloved position of being the childless uncle who could indulge his nieces and nephews. When Presley was nearing his death, my father and I drove up to Chicago together to visit him. I had just finished graduate school. I majored in pastoral counseling in both my master's and my doctorate at Vanderbilt. But there was something about my own character that I had never been able to understand. And when you are a grad student in counseling, you have to be in counseling while you are studying it. So I had worked with my counseling professor on the issue of anger in my own life. Dr. Mills was certain that it was something that stemmed from my family of origin, but in all the 5 years that I saw Dr. Mills weekly, I could never quite put my finger on what it was all about. But this visit to see my dying uncle was when it all started to become clear to me. Presley was a very meticulous man. His lawn and his garden were always perfectly manicured. His home was spotless. His personal appearance would make you think of Beau Brummely. But in his final weeks of life, everything was falling apart. His clothes hung on him like burlap bags. The lawn was shaggy, the garden was full of weeds, and even the house was in bad shape. The silver desperately needed to be polished. There were cobwebs in the corners and dust bunnies on the hardwood floors. My father was stomping around in rage. He wanted to fire the neighbor who was mowing the lawn. He wanted to fire the cleaning lady who was slacking off and the healthcare workers who were not properly attending to Presley's appearance. Dad was like a bomb, just ready to go off at any second. But I realized that my widowed uncle was frankly, he was just lonely in his last days. So when the neighbor came to mow, after he'd cut the grass, he would get out a lawn chair and they would sit in the lawn and just talk, rather than doing the meticulous weeding and trimming that he normally did. The cleaning lady, who had worked for Presley for many years, would make 2 cups of coffee and sit down at the breakfast table and just listen as Presley processed his life memories. Even the healthcare workers, who hadn't known him as long, but they could tell that he was nearing his death, and so they did more to make him feel comfortable and loved than spending time shaving or getting him properly dressed up. Presley had spent his entire life casting his bread on the waters, and as they say, it was coming back to him. He was surrounded by love, except for my father. And yet, I could say persuasively that probably no one loved Presley more than my father did. My father had looked up to his oldest brother as a father figure. Presley was the only person my dad ever turned to for advice or help. So what my dad saw when we got there and we realized Presley wasn't going to pull through this one, he wasn't going to recover, that he was in fact going to die, what my dad saw scared him to death. Grief and fear filled him, but it all came out as anger. Dad needed to feel sad. He needed to grieve the inevitable with Presley, that 2 of them should have been able to talk about Presley's impending death. Or, more classic to the macho man that my dad was and that I was raised to be, he was stomping around trying to find a way to fix mortality itself, to stop Presley from dying, which he managed to come out with only shouted condemnations at the cleaning lady, yelling at the lawn guy, and generally making me and Presley feel very uncomfortable. I now call it hillbilly rage, a kind of unreflective anger that I frankly, see in my siblings and in my siblings' children. Because anger poses as strength. It poses as ferocity, forcefulness. Anger always presumes to be in charge, to be potentially dangerous or threatening. We see it in Fox News consumers who seem to think that anger even makes them smart enough to be condescending towards facts and information. When in fact, anger is none of those things. Anger is fear, it's shame, it's a host of other emotions, all of which, if you let yourself show fear or shame or embarrassment or loneliness or rejection or anxiety, that would show weakness. So in my family system, the way you expressed all of those emotions was as anger. Now, that's not to say that anger is always inappropriate. You can't say that middle C on a piano is the wrong key. It's an important key. It's one that is played repeatedly in most songs. However, it's not the only key. Ask my piano teacher from my youth. You can play middle C disastrously wrongly. You're going to play it several times in a song, but there are times that you can mess up even playing that familiar note. My favorite quote from Aristotle's The Nicomachean Ethics is, anyone can be angry. That's easy. But to be angry with the right person, to the right degree, at the right time, for the right purpose, and in the right way, that's not easy. I don't know how many generations this hillbilly rage goes back in my family, but I know this: I've made it my lifelong goal to bring it to an end in my life. I don't want it. But that white male rage is how President Trump got elected in the first place. It's not rational. That hillbilly rage can overcome facts, information, analysis, critical thinking, and it becomes its own logic, its own raison d'etre, its own literal force. Now, there are a lot of reasons to be pretty careful about throwing around psychological diagnoses, but a painful reality about our emotions, all of them, is that we need to be aware of them. We need to be able to name them, to understand them. If we don't, they will take control of our lives. Our emotions will control us if we are resolutely defiant of ever identifying what they are. I appreciated hearing Dr. Cornel West riffing on the observation that Socrates never cried and Jesus never laughed. At least according to Plato, even as Socrates was being handed the cup of hemlock that was the means of execution of the city of Athens, even when everyone around him was weeping, Socrates refused to be sad. He cheerfully talked with his friends and simply accepted his unjust execution. Socrates was a Stoic. He insisted on a life of the mind and was convinced that displays of emotion were simply a failure to properly discipline the mind. I don't think it's at all fair to describe Jesus as being the opposite of Stoicism, but while the Gospels tell us that Jesus got angry, that he was sometimes afraid, that he wept, that he felt grief and sorrow, and certainly he loved friends and children, but the New Testament never mentions that Jesus ever laughed. They never use the word happy. Of course, Plato is not trying to give us an accurate biographical sketch of Socrates, and the gospel writers never met the historical Jesus and would be completely incapable of giving us a comprehensive view of the character of the historical Jesus. But Dr. West quotes this observation about Socrates and Jesus as a way of exploring both the range of our emotion and our flawed efforts at suppressing them or controlling them. I'd like to think that the historical Socrates was able to cry when his dog died, and that the historical Jesus would have had a good belly laugh at any early Palestinian version of a rabbi, a priest, and an imam walk into a bar. The famous psychiatrist M. Scott Peck talked about the need for emotional balance, to strike a proper balance. Our emotions can either work for us or they can run over us. Now, I hesitate to use two musical instrument illustrations in any one sermon since I can't play any of them. But it's obvious that for the strings on a guitar to work, they have to have the right amount of tension on them. If a string is too loose, the string doesn't play at all. If it's too tight, the instrument will break. And between those two extremes, there are many wrong ways of tuning a guitar and basically only one right way. Babies will cry when they're hungry. They'll cry when they're wet. They'll cry when they're lonely, when they're bored, when they're sick, when they're scared. And part of growing up is learning that you don't have to cry about everything. A generation ago, when I first started writing opinion columns for the News Leader, I was often outraged by the many letters that the opinion editor would publish in response to my thoughtful and well-researched columns. And many of the letters that the editor would publish were really just naked personal attacks. They were often mean and inaccurate. One guy sent a letter to the News Leader and to all the TV stations in town saying that he was going to kill me. The TV stations notified me and the police that they had a death threat. My editor at the News Leader contacted the guy and said, "You can't threaten to kill him. You can, however, say he ought to be killed." And that's the letter that they published. Yeah. Over the years, I had about a dozen different editors of the opinion page, but that first one was indisputably the worst. I literally lost sleep over a lot of the letters that he published. I felt angry, I felt ashamed, I was hurt, I felt rejected and scorned. But the editor that I did not care for said, "Roger, if you're going to put your name on a controversial article, you just have to take whatever you get in response." So I had to say, "Well, Robert Ledger, I guess I will take whatever irrational criticism comes as a part of trying to get the public to think about ethics. You know, you can learn from an honest critic, but the rest of them, you just have to get to a point where you recognize that lions don't spend a lot of time thinking about what sheep's opinions are." Learning to live with public criticism was not easy for me, and I don't like it now. But if I had ever gone to a doctor to tell my doctor about the stress I was feeling as an opinion writer, the pressure I was under, the public scorn I was suffering, I have little doubt that that doctor would have given me a prescription for some antidepressant, in the serotonin family usually, and some kind of benzodiazepine, a Xanax or something like it for anxiety, and maybe even something for sleep, usually trazodone or Ambien, all highly addictive drugs. About 60 million Americans take something to help them sleep. About 10% of adults take either Xanax or some other benzodiazepine. And I'm not saying that there are not people who need those medications. I'm just saying that those numbers are awfully high, aren't they? I'm not a medical doctor, but what I know of providing medical care to about 40,000 people in the rural parts of Nicaragua, when I was on the board of the Rainbow Network in the brief time that I was director, we supplied a pharmacy for our doctors that cared for these 40,000 people in the Matagalpa region of Nicaragua, but we did not supply any sleep medications, anxiety medications, or antidepressants. I can't tell you exactly how to tune that guitar string, but somewhere between 0 or 10 to 20% of the population, there's a lot of room for abuse in there. And that's without even mentioning how many people use alcohol or marijuana or cocaine in order to corral their emotions. I was talking to a woman recently who told me that she takes a Xanax every single morning. And I asked her, "What are you panicking about?" And she said, "I have no idea. I just know that the pill helps." Just as Paul Tomlinson and I were talking about in July when we talked about depression treatment, your emotions are not your enemies, but they also are not the stagecoach driver of your life. Your emotions should be listened to before they are medicated away. One author I read recently suggested that the Trump administration itself is to blame for the rapid increase in anxiety medications. And I can sort of see that. I've self-medicated more than once since Trump was elected. But I can tell you from repeated experience that the politics and economics in Nicaragua are every bit as bad as they are in the United States, and generally much, much worse. And you never encounter anxiety disorders. What I'm looking for here is some greater sense of balance. I do believe that I have seen men die young because they were so stoic that they never allowed themselves to either feel or to express their emotions. I believe that I have had any number of what I call emotional terrorists in my life who regularly give themselves permission to just give vent to whatever they're feeling, to cloud up and rain all over everyone around them, whether it's through personal insults or just character assaults or whatever, just because they are feeling insecure or challenged or depressed or whatever. They just give themselves permission. You know, why keep your feelings bottled up when you can victimize the people around you? Obviously, some people are more sensitive than others, and absolutely everyone is sensitive about some things. I know that I have some emotional triggers. There are ways that people sometimes try to tease me that just make me seethe. And I'm not going to tell you what they are because I might do them. But none of them are ever going to force me to take medication to deal with it. As are most adoptive parents, especially in interracial adoption, as in my family, I can quickly channel my inner lion if someone says anything demeaning about my daughter or her race. As my friend Dan Goodwin says sometimes, I will occasionally explain to someone exactly how the cow ate the cabbage. It's an educational service that I provide without charge. But I'm alarmed when people just seem to be willing to catalog their triggers. You know, we've all got some. I've got a hot button if you try hard enough to find it, but none of us should let ourselves just be covered in hot buttons. There's no contest here of seeing if I can be more easily offended than everyone else around me. There is a sense in which we are somehow educating the public to always be hypersensitive. You've heard me quote Carl Jung before in saying that all neuroses are a replacement for legitimate suffering. And maybe Jung is overstating the case a bit, but I don't think he's missing the mark by much. We use our neuroses as a way of not dealing with things that are more personal and perhaps more important. We need to understand our negative emotions, not just turn over the steering wheel to them. We should probably have Paul Tomlinson come back to talk about this more comprehensively, but psychologists like to talk about emotional intelligence. The 4 pillars of emotional intelligence are self-awareness, self-management, social awareness, and relationship management. It's easy for me to see that virtually no one in my family of origin has ever become self-aware of their hillbilly rage, and they possibly wouldn't even know what I was talking about if any of them listened to my sermons, which I'm sure they don't. Many people think that their emotions just come out of thin air and that they are what they are, and if you feel it, you must then inflict it on the rest of the world. And that, men and women, is not true. We all have to work to be aware of our emotions in order to take that second step, which is self-management. We are not, after all babies still crying about everything. We don't have to be alarmed by having feelings to the point that we immediately go and seek prescription meds to make them go away, or using illegal drugs or alcohol to make them go away. Self-awareness and self-management involves you examining your own life and choosing to learn from and manage your emotions through your own powerful decisions. A psychologist friend of mine tells me that she likes to tell her clients it's like the difference between going to see a chiropractor and going to yoga classes. They accomplish about the same thing, but a yoga class requires you to go a couple of times a week and actually exercise to accomplish what you might hope to have accomplished by having a chiropractor do what they call adjusting your spine, which, by the way, is not a thing. But people will go to a chiropractor to get a fix that they could get themselves if they would do the proper kind of stretching and exercise to get it out. Let the congregation say amen. That was timid. That means I'm going to have to do a little more persuasion. But you understand, in this, as in all other things, this is just my opinion. It just is coincidental that I'm right. If we use our feelings to be able to empathize with members of our society, then it can meaningfully change our society. So that, for example, if we are able to feel with the 2 million people that are in federal, state, and city jails right now, if we are able to feel with the parents whose children have been taken from them and put into internment camps on our nation's border, if you can feel with them, if you can use your emotions to empathize with them, then we can change society. We have 2 million people in prison. We have 7 million on parole. We have about 30,000 children in internment camps only because most Americans don't give a damn. That's the only way that can go on. As soon as we start to care, it will stop. And emotional intelligence should include some relationship awareness that helps us to not inflict our most irrational feelings on those who are the closest to us. My public role, both in print and in internet media, and you can imagine, we have about 15,000 people that download our videos and podcasts every week, and among those 15,000 people, not all of them are entirely intact. And so an awful lot of people give themselves permission to take a pound of flesh out of me as a way of compensating for their fear or their prejudice or their ignorance. So I literally have to consciously conserve my energy such that when someone in a casual setting just throws out some kind of emotional hand grenade, if they give themselves permission to make a withdrawal from my emotional bank account to compensate for their insecurities or their malice, then I sometimes really do have to put some distance between myself and that person. Emotional terrorism is not a human right. You don't get to just cut up the people around you. We should all have sufficient emotional intelligence not to inflict emotional harm on others. We should also have enough self-respect to not tolerate it out of others. There is a middle path between stoicism and some kind of hysteria in which you can express yourself rather than embrace heart disease, and you can grow beyond the kind of hillbilly hostility, which is little more than an infant crying in a poopy diaper. You can manage your emotions without ever having to just fully suppress them or try to medicate them away. Now, I'm not trying to defame pharmaceutical companies or even Socrates or Jesus for that matter. I'm just trying to advocate for the awareness that being spiritual people means trying to be healthy in the most natural way possible with as few trips to Walgreens as you can manage. As I've cautioned you before, no one should change their medication regimen based solely on what I have said in public. But if you do decide to go talk to your doctor about these things, you can tell her that I sent you. And before you turn to drugs or alcohol to manage your difficult emotions, let me just tell you what works for me. Take up scuba diving. Your phone doesn't work on the reef, and no one can text you. And it turns out, no one can talk to you without drowning. Now, you may say that's just my opinion, but you know, I am a doctor of sorts.
Thank you for watching our videos. We are entirely dependent on the donations of our listeners and members. We hope that you find this content to be important enough to help us to keep offering these videos to the public at no charge by becoming a regular contributor. Please click on the donate button on our website at www.spfccc.org. Thank you for your support of progressive religious programming.